guys, it's Sam, and this is my October wrap-up. So in October, I read 8 books and DNF'd 1, which was a really great reading month. Actually, I enjoyed most of what I read, as you'll see in a second. And I also want to point out that this was like my entirely spooky reading month. I read some romances in there, like, because that's what I read before bed, but I was reading all spooky books. And before we get into it, I mentioned this a couple other places, but I wanted to mention it here where, like, my, most viewed platform. This time last year, I was in such a bad anxiety flare with my panic disorder that I was having daily panic attacks that were like through the roof, like nauseous, could barely eat, couldn't sleep well, was terrified of like everything, and really triggered by like anything spooky. And this year I was able to read like a bunch of scary books, because I know that like my level of scary is different from other people's, but for me these were books that like were potentially triggering, and one that even did trigger me last year, and I was fine, totally fine. So if you're going through a hard time mental health wise, no matter what it is, as far as like anxiety, depression, anything like that, just know that like even though it seems like it's never going to end, because it truly felt like I was going to be feeling like that forever, even though I knew as like a mental health professional that I wouldn't, it still felt that way. Just know that this horrible time, as far as like a flare in your mental health, like it will pass. That is the nature of life and mental health and change. It will pass, I promise you. Because if you would have told me last year that I would have read all these books that I read this month, I would have been like, I don't know how you can, because we are not in a mental state to do any of that. And now I'm in a better place emotionally, a lot of external stressors are gone, and I'm on proper anxiety medication, and I was fine. So just know that, if you're going through something rough, mental health wise, I promise you it will pass. Hang in there. I promise you it will pass. So I say all that about spooky books, and the first book that I do want to talk about, and the first book that I read, was Written in the Stars by Alexandria Bellafleur. This is a book that either is about to come out or like just came out. I got it through NetGalley. And this is a female-female contemporary adult romance that is sort of like has some inspiration from like Pride and Prejudice and like Bridget Jones's Diary, like a little bit. It's not retellings of that, but it has like those themes, and it follows both women's perspectives. And I believe if at least one of them, or maybe both of them, are bisexual, but I'm not sure. And the like Darcy S character, whose name actually is Darcy, but she's a woman. She is like very serious, straight-laced, has some stuff going on in her like background that makes her like very closed off from people. And her brother sets her up on a date with the other main character, who is a like more free spirit astrologer and believes in like true love, where the Darcy character does not. And they go on this date, and it's kind of awful, but it has this like, again, like Pride and Prejudice, like Bridget Jones feel to it, and then sort of everything takes off from there, because they eventually have to start fake dating because of both of their individual like families' sort of expectations of them. This was so good. This does take place around the holidays, but it does not feel like a holiday book at all, because again, I read it in October, and I've been avoiding all of my holiday reads until like after Halloween, but this was fine. I adored this. It was so good with like the fake dating, the way that they were like drawn to each other. The side characters were also really fun. The astrologer character is great because, as you guys know, I'm like a little bit, I'm into astrology sometimes. I still am like, but I am, I like it. So seeing that character is really cool, because she would also like write for the blog. Her blog is like pretty famous, and like have all these different things that like match up with different zodiac signs, and they were like really spot on. And the like miscommunication and stuff was not too overdone or dramatic, and it was just really good and really cute, and I'm really enjoying it. And I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I then read City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. And this is the first book in an adult fantasy trilogy. I've already done a full review for this and discussion, so I'll link the review on the screen. This follows the main character of Nahri. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think I pronounced it right in the review, but I've looked it up a few times since, so I'm sorry about my pronunciation. I really do try with pronouncing ethnic names, but I still get it wrong sometimes, just because it's not like my native language and like the names that I'm really used to. So I do try, I do look it up before, I promise. But Nahri lives in Cairo, 18th century Cairo, and she is kind of like a con woman and like a thief, but she also has this like healing ability. And during one ritual that she's doing, she ends up accidentally summoning a jinn warrior, and ends up getting like taken to the city of Daevabad, which is where all the jinn are, and everything kind of goes from there. We also get another perspective of another jinn actually in Daevabad from like almost like the other side of things, and we get his perspective. So we get a lot of like Nahri being exposed to some of this stuff, but then also some of the background political stuff from the other character's perspective. This was fantastic. I loved the world, I loved the characters, I loved the plot, I love all political intrigue, I love the magic, I love everything about this. This was like a wild ride terrified the whole time. I was very engrossed, and the thing that I mentioned in my review and discussion as well is because there's all these like different sort of like political sides, I never knew who I was pulling for. Like, I still don't. Like, at the end of the book, I still don't know like whose side I'm on, because it's so complicated and there's so much going on. So I'm very intrigued by this and very excited for the rest of the series, and I'm hoping to continue it like no later than December, honestly, because I don't want to like get too far out of this world and like forget a lot of things. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Definitely a new favorite. Then I read House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. Oh, I forgot to mention that I did the Hocus Pocus readathon, and I actually did everything for the readathon. So I did all the prompts for the readathon. The only thing that I wasn't able to do was the 24-hour readathon part of it, because the day of the 24-hour readathon that I was actually going to do for Dewey's, I was really busy and I was working and all this stuff. So I didn't end up doing that. So I kind of like didn't succeed as much as I would have liked to, but I watched the movie, I read all the books, I did a lot. So very happy about that. Anyway, back to House of Salt and Sorrows. This is a standalone YA, like kind of horror, gothic horror story. This is a gothic 12 dancing princesses retelling. And in this story, our main character of Anna Lee, who is like the 4th in line or something to like the noble area. I mean, her dad's not like king, but like he's sort of in charge in this like fantasy world of this island. And 3 of her older sisters have already died tragically over the years. And so everyone assumes there's this like curse on them. She actually thinks that these deaths were not accidents, and she starts looking into it, and everything's kind of going from there. So we have elements of like sort of like a haunted house, a ghost story, a murder mystery, all this magic and all this stuff. I've done a full review on this, so I'll link that on the screen. There are trigger warnings in here just for like your general horror stuff of like death of parents and siblings. It's like a lot of death in general, gore, there's like some gory bits, and ghost stuff. I did talk about, even though I haven't watched this movie, this sort of reminded me of like Crimson Peak, because I know in Crimson Peak there's like the scary ghost stuff, but like it's not overall like a horror movie, it's more of like a gothic story, and that's very much what this was. I inhale read this in like 2 days. I really enjoyed this. There were some things that were weaker. There's like a romance part that was not really that great for me, and the very end plot-wise was like really messy, and there was a lot of like things that were brought in last minute that I just felt like could have happened sooner, and like the pacing would have been better. But overall, I still really liked this. It was a nice creepy atmosphere the whole way through, and a great October read, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I then read A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. This is the first book in a adult fantasy series that follows our main character of Elle, and she is a student at this school that is just like a magical school, basically, that is sitting in the void where all the magical kids go, but the school is actively trying to kill them. The school's trying to kill them. There's monsters in the school for every single thing you could possibly think of trying to kill them, and to graduate they have to basically go through a horde of monsters to get out of the school. And there's like no teachers. The school just kind of like teaches them, and Elle has been an outcast like the whole time because she is not part of like the upper levels of like magical society or anything like that. And it all starts off with her kind of unlikely team up with the like resident like good guy in the school who's like trying to save everybody, and everything kind of goes from there. So this book had a lot of talk this month, and I don't want to get into that because that would make this all very, very long. But we did discuss it in our House Salt Book Club live show because this was our book for this month, so I will link that on the screen because we talk about that in depth. Also, I will link my Goodreads review down below because I talk about all that in depth as well, and give 2 reviews from both sides of people's like feelings about this book and everything that kind of happened with sort of like the drama, I guess. I don't want to call it drama, discussion around this book. Overall, what we talked about in the live show, and that all of us kind of agreed on because we all have very similar feelings about this book, is that the premise was really cool. The world is really awesome. Like, we all really liked the world, and we really liked our 2 main characters a lot, especially Elle. But a lot of other things about the story are kind of messy. A lot of the other characters are like one-dimensional, and there's certain things that made it so a lot of the problems that people have with the book stand out more due to kind of like bad writing elements. So I loved the world, but there was a lot of world building info dumping at the very beginning of the book and like kind of throughout, and it took me a little while to get attached to our characters, but once I did, I really was invested, and I am looking forward to the rest of this series, and I hope some of the things about the writing will be fixed for future installments of this series. But I gave this 3.75 out of 5 stars. This did have trigger warnings for death and violence, just a lot of like scary monster gore things, so all that general deadly school spookiness. I then read Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey. This is a adult contemporary romance. Georgie is like the baby of her family. She is actually like a professional clown, and no one really takes her seriously. And since she was a kid, she was in love with her brother's best friend, Travis. And we get both our perspectives. Travis is a recently early retired baseball player who had an injury, and so now he's back in town and like doesn't know what to do with his life and is just feeling really sorry for himself. And he has this history of being like a playboy, and she ends up coming back into his life because she just really likes being around him and like wants to help him get out of this funk. But then he realizes that he could have an opportunity for this job, and he needs to like brighten up his image of like not being this playboy anymore, and so they fake date. I actually didn't dislike this as much as I thought I might, because when I started reading it, a lot of people told me that they hated this book and that there was a lot of things they didn't like. So I was like, I'm not sure. I got this from my library just because it was available at the time, so, and I had heard about it. So I didn't like this a ton, but I didn't hate it as much as I thought I would. I didn't really, like, I pulled for their relationship a bit, but I think the thing that gets a lot of people is that there is a lot of like sort of possessive language from him. He calls her baby girl so much that if you took a shot every time I said baby girl, you would be dead. He just always says that. And then, but like all of this is very consensual. So the feeling that I got throughout, and some people when they read my review were like, what? But the feeling that I got was, I was like, this feels like a vanilla dom-sub relationship, like a vanilla kinky relationship. If you don't know what that means, please Google it, because I'm not going to do it here because this video might get demonetized. But basically, I think people would have responded better to this book if it just would have been like a straight up kinky book. And instead it was like twisted into like this vanilla dynamic, which makes it more problematic. But if it was just like a kinky book, because that's kind of what a lot of it sort of implies, then I think it would have been a little bit more fine. But because it was just more of like a standard vanilla contemporary romance, some of his like language is just like a little bit cringy, and there's like this fetishization of like her being like innocent and like younger and a virgin. So it's very like, oh. But again, I'm like, if you would have just made it like DS and like maybe him having like a little kink or something, it would have been like fine over in that genre of book, and I wouldn't have read it. And a lot of people would have read it that weren't looking for that, but I think this was almost like mismarketed in a way, or like I don't know, like it didn't go as far as it should have. So that's what made people like feel like it was weird. So anyway, I didn't end up like loving this. Could I still read more books in this series? Like, maybe, I don't know. Like, I was just kind of, it would end up being a 2-star for me. I think some things about the plot were like a little bit overdone as far as miscommunication. And then at the end, I feel like Travis changed his mind about what he wanted out of life and his romantic life, like a little bit too drastically for me to find it believable. But it was still like an easy read. It was like fine. I then read Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is the first book in a adult fantasy / sci-fi trilogy. I've already done a full review for this as well, so I'll link that on the screen. This does have a number of triggers for like necromancy, blood, and like, I think there might have been some self-harm stuff with the blood, but I'm not remembering right now. Violence, death, gore. I mentioned bone stuff, cancer, and suicide. But this follows the main character of Gideon, and she has been a part of the Ninth House for her whole life, but she's an orphan. She doesn't really know where she's from, and a turn of events ends up happening where she has to go with her arch nemesis, who's basically like the princess of the Ninth House and like the head necromancer of the Ninth House, and go to the first house to explore this like haunted palace mansion thing in order for the necromancers to potentially become like high necromancers. They're not called that, but like for lack of a better term. And once they get there, they discover there's a bunch of like weird scientific experiments that they are having to look into, and people that are there all start dying. So it becomes this like, you know, haunted mansion, haunted palace mystery, murder mystery thing with lesbian necromancers in space. It's a wild ride if you haven't picked up on that. So this was actually the book that triggered me last year when I was in my panic flare, and then I was able to read it totally fine and like had a great time reading it this time around. This book is definitely not for everybody. It's very polarizing, but I end up really enjoying it. I loved the world that's like space magic, bone magic, necromancers, especially in the Ninth House. Their specialization is bone magic, which is really fun. I liked a lot of our characters. I did a full talking about like all of them in my gush for this book, so that's again linked through the review. Gideon's sense of humor broke up a lot of the creepiness, even though not everyone's gonna like Gideon's sense of humor. I still really enjoyed it. And the plot was just like trying to figure out what was happening with the experiments and the people dying and like, is this haunted? What's going on? It was just really fun. There were parts at the end that were like a little bit confusing and muddled for me and like just felt like a little bit over the top, but overall I really enjoyed this and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I did mention in my reviews that I wasn't sure if I would continue, but basically all of the comments convinced me to continue with the series, so I will be continuing with the series. I then read Undercover Bromance by Lisa K. Adams. This is the second book in the Bromance book club series, although they can all be read as standalones. This follows two characters from the first book, Liv and Mac. Liv is the main character from the first book's sister that we get introduced to, and then Mac is one of the other guys in the Bromance book club. This does have some triggers for all off page, but like mentions of rape, sexual abuse, some stalking, an incarcerated parent, and witnessing domestic violence from parents. So in this book, Liv and Mac end up teaming up to take down Liv's boss, who is sexually harassing women at the workplace. And so that's like kind of what it revolves around. This, because of that plot, felt like way less of a romance. Like it is Liv and Mac's romance, but there's this huge like almost like social justice plot, which generally speaking I tend to like, but it was so like in your face this time, and I felt like in a way that was like, I don't know, where it just felt like the characters wanted to seem like really woke, and I think they made a lot of missteps as well. Like it was a lot of characters explaining to other characters why they shouldn't be saying the things they were saying, and it was like a lot of like teaching moments in a way that felt like kind of jarring, which is weird to say for me because I'm all about that kind of stuff, but like it just wasn't done super well. Liv as a main character, I thought I was gonna like more than I liked her in the first book, and I liked her less. She does a lot of things that are like really shitty that she does kind of learn from, but it takes her like a really long time, and I don't quite believe it because she's very judgmental towards like other women and women in these situations that she's trying to kind of like be the savior for, which is just like really icky and rubs me the wrong way. And she just like continually treats people around her like pretty badly, and I don't feel like she learns from that really well. So it made me not really pull for them, but I really am excited for the third book in the series, which I do already have from NetGalley, because the two characters that are in that were in this book like a little more frequently, and I love them like a lot. So I'm really hoping that one's really good and gets me back to how I felt about the first book, Bromance Book Club, because I loved the first book, really didn't like this one, and I hope I really like the next one. So I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read this month was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Many of you probably already know about this book, but this is the first book in a adult fantasy, like urban fantasy series. It follows the main character of Alex, and she is a student at Yale, but she's really there less for the school part and more to be a part of this like underground society that oversees all of the other magical societies' powers. This is the society that kind of keeps everything in check and makes sure that all those other magical societies like don't run amok, and she can actually see ghosts. So we follow mostly her perspective, but we also follow her mentor, who's another student, just like a little bit older, Darlington's perspective for part of the book. Again, you probably already know these things, but this book is really heavy with a lot of triggering content in it, so the triggers that I noticed, but please look up a full list because I could have blatantly missed some, are rape, murder, child molestation, physical and emotional abuse from a partner, grooming, gore, possession, drug abuse, overdose, and death of a friend. There's a lot in here. But this is a book that I never really thought that I was going to get to read because I thought that the triggering content was going to be too much. Not so much that stuff, but like it had ghosts and possession in it, and that used to be something that really bothered me before I was properly medicated. Supernatural stuff used to really freak me out. And now I still tread carefully. I'm not going out reading horror books, but this actually bothered me less than Gideon the Ninth did. So with that being said, I actually enjoyed this more than I thought I would because this is such a polarizing book. The world is interesting. I like the dark academia focus, and this, I think one of the reasons I liked this more than I thought I would is because it feels so much like an urban fantasy, like your classic urban fantasies that I used to read a lot in high school. So it's almost like a modern take on that with the dark academia, but it has like your like hardened protagonist who's been through a lot of trauma, and it's not really written for gratuitous sake because this is written by a woman, so it's not like overdone in my opinion, and that whole like world thing is really interesting. The magics of all the different houses are really cool. The characters did take a little bit of time to grow on me. So Alex I started liking towards the very end, but she did take some time to grow on me, and you get like revealed more of her story, and I feel like you come to really appreciate her. And what I really liked about her and what made this book less scary for me is actually how empowered she is, particularly with the ghosts and the possession stuff and all of that, which I will talk about all in my vlog for this book because I have done a full reading vlog for this, which is coming up on Monday. But I really liked how empowered she was, and I just find her backstory and like what she can do very interesting, especially when we learn more about that at the end. And then as far as the plot, I really started enjoying it like about halfway through. The first part is very slow, and I was like, okay, let's get to it. And then you start to kind of discover a lot of like the mystery and what's happened, and we get kind of like 2 timelines between her and Darlington's perspective, so you sort of know in her perspective some stuff that's happened and like all of that. So once we get all of that mystery stuff coming together, it gets really interesting, and the end was also really interesting. Although there's some things that I feel like weren't, I mean, they weren't explained because there's more books in the series, but like, it is just kind of like a setup for later like books and stuff. But I end up enjoying this, like I said, more than I thought I would, and I gave it 3.75 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I attempted to read but actually DNF'd was Where Dreams Descend by Janella Angelis. This was actually my Patreon book pick for the month, so every month my Patreon supporters get to vote for a book that I will usually read, I at least attempt to read it and review, but this again was a DNF. They don't make me push through books that I'm not enjoying because they are blessed sweet souls. And this I thought was going to be everything that I wanted. The comps were that it was like The Night Circus meets Phantom of the Opera meets Moulin Rouge, which are some of my favorite things. But when I started reading this, there was something that I still can't quite pinpoint, but a lot of people have said a similar thing to me since I wrote my review. But there's something I can't pinpoint about like the writing style that I couldn't get into it. I didn't like it. Like, it was just rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't really get connected to our characters. I got like 20% of the way, at least almost 20% of the way into it before giving up on it. But I just didn't care. I didn't care at all. I didn't care about the world. I didn't care about the plot. I didn't care about the characters. I didn't care about any of it. So even though on paper this should have been a favorite and something that I was like really like just immediately pulled into, I wasn't, and I did not want to force myself to keep reading. So this was a DNF for me. So that is it for all the books that I read this month. I had some like low lows, but I also had some really high highs as far as books that I really enjoyed. So comment down below and let me know how your reading month went. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.